All righty, are we all set to go? Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you can hear me okay. I apologize for the delay. We had a little bit of technical difficulty, but it looks like we are all set now. And thank you so much for joining the session this afternoon on creating an equitable and culturally responsive classroom. I bring you greetings from chilly and snowy Cincinnati, Ohio here, and I am going to share my screen in just a moment, and we're going to get started. Since this is in a webinar format, we won't be able to have the traditional chat format that's available in Zoom, but we will have an opportunity for questions and such. My name is Dr. Lori Wright, and it is a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I'm not going to go through an extended biography or anything like that. I think that information was already made available to you, but I hope that you have come ready to really engage in a robust conversation around the role that culture plays in how we interact and how we serve our students. And so therefore, the kind of cultural responsiveness and cultural humility that we need to embrace to ensure that we are being cultural brokers and supporting student success in our classroom. So I'm getting ready to share my screen. And so just bear with me for 1 second and we're going to get this party started. Okay, and I'm going to start my presentation. All righty, so here we go. All righty. So creating an inclusive, diverse, and equitable school culture is our theme for today, and there is a lot of information in here, and I know that we are limited in time and scope, and so some parts I may move through a little bit quicker than others, but certainly, if you have questions or, if there's even follow-up after today's session, we can certainly do that. All right, so our session learning outcomes for today, to become better prepared to interact within a different cultural context. To increase our knowledge of cultural humility, cultural responsiveness, and implicit bias, and how that directly and indirectly impacts student achievement. So to increase our understanding of how all of those pieces converge, especially within a classroom or educational context, and to hopefully gain a deeper understanding of our personal perceptions and how these perceptions influence teaching and learning. And I might even replace perceptions with bias. What are those blind spots? What are those hidden areas that we're really not aware of, but how to gain a deeper understanding of how those impact or influence our teaching and our ability for our students to learn, because they're coming to us with blind spots and biases as well. So setting the context for our conversation today, and we're going to talk a lot about culture. And this quote, I love this quote from William Ryan, and this was from 1972. And so, this discussion around cultural competence and cultural responsiveness has certainly been around for quite a while. So he says, and I quote, "We are dealing, it would seem, not so much with culturally deprived students as with culturally depriving schools. The task to be accomplished is not to revise, amend, and repair deficient students, but to alter and transform the atmosphere and operations of the schools to which we commit these children." And I think that is really, if you don't leave with anything else, I think that is an important context to have for our discussion today and really going forward. And I think, all of us can agree that when we're looking at, state report cards, and we're looking at standardized testing. We're looking at, school and district data all the time and disaggregating that data, trying to make sense of that data. Oftentimes, especially when we're looking at students who are falling behind, we look at the achievement gap. A lot of the emphasis is on where where are students deficient? What are those areas that we need to work on as far as student? That the lens is always on the student. Why aren't they achieving? Why aren't they being successful? In our attempts to revise and amend and repair the deficiencies that our students bring, and how can we benchmark better, and what are our learning outcomes, and all of those conversations. But I've been in higher education for 29 years. Prior to starting in higher ed, I was a high school counselor for a few years, and all of my work in higher ed has always been around this, the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation. And in recent years, have done more consulting and working with schools and districts, really around this idea of how we alter and transform the atmosphere and operations of the schools. So taking the lens off of the ways in which we feel our students are deficient, and really looking at the ways in which our systems and our structures, our policies and our processes within the school environment, how those impact and impede often student learning and student achievement. And really at the heart of a lot of those discussions, which unfortunately many are really not equipped to have with any great detail, is this notion of culture. And I think too often we kind of skip over, or we really don't spend enough time understanding the role that culture plays. We all have a culture. Our school buildings have a culture, our communities have a culture, our families have a culture. Many of us, just finished celebrating a very unorthodox Thanksgiving because of COVID, but we could probably look around and still see, a lot of those cultural influences and traditions that we even uphold within our families. And so when we're looking at how do we amend, how do we create these culturally responsive educational spaces, we really can't, and I can't emphasize enough the role that culture needs to take, and how we really need to center that in the middle and at the forefront of all of our discussions when we're looking at how do we transform our educational spaces and make them spaces where students can learn and grow and thrive. Culture, is to humans as water is to fish. So our culture, or those are the water to fish. That's where they thrive. That's where they breathe. That's where they get their oxygen and their nourishment. And the same can be said really for us as humans. Who are we apart from culture? Who are we apart from our traditions, our beliefs, our values? Our cultures is really centers us in our core. It really forms the core of who we are and in our identity, how we describe ourselves. What are the things that we believe to be true? Our language, our expressions, our traditions. And so it's, again, not, we really can't underscore, or we really can't state too strongly the role that culture plays in everything that we do, and especially within our education spaces. Defining culture. Culture is a way of life of a group of people, the behaviors, the beliefs, values, norms, language, and symbols that they accept, generally without thinking about them, and that are passed along by communication and imitation from one generation to the next. And I think, especially if we look at our familial culture, in our traditions, we really can, see how, recipes and how we celebrate holidays, how we grieve, how we celebrate birthday milestones, what we do around, marriage and children, all of those things are rich traditions that are passed from one generation to the next. And we kind of just go about, our beliefs and our values and our norms and behaviors. They're just things that we generally do without really even thinking about them. So understanding culture, and I'm going to move my screen up here just a little so I can get this out of the way. There we go. Culture becomes our reality. It's the map that guides us. It's the window through which we view the world. And to attack someone's culture is to attack that person's innermost self. Again, we all have a culture. And by attacking a person's culture, one way to also look at that, is when we marginalize, when we silence, when we don't pay attention. to the role and the influence of culture and how that impacts student learning and their ability to make sense of the world, even in this education space that again has its own culture. We really are attacking that person's innermost self. Keep going back to that picture we just saw, that culture is to humans as water is to fish. Okay, and so this is a picture of an iceberg, and we love the idiom, the axiom at the tip of the iceberg. You know, we talk about, you know, we've just started. You know, you just hit the tip of the iceberg, so we see a little bit of the iceberg that sticks out above the water, but most of the iceberg, and what makes up the iceberg is below the surface. You can't see it, but it's nonetheless, it's still there. And culture oftentimes is likened to this iceberg. You know, there's the tip of the iceberg that we see, that's just a little bit, that's just scratching the surface, but the core and the crux of the iceberg is below the surface. So what are some of the things that we see culturally represented kind of in that above the surface? You know, the foods that we eat, the way that we dress, the music that we listen to, even our visual art, the way that we express in terms of drama and our crafts, our dance, our literature, language, celebrations. But below the surface are all of those things that really make up the core of who we are, our funds of knowledge, the assumptions that we have, our ethnicity, background, beliefs, our socioeconomic status, the way that we interact socially, our perceptions, our conversational patterns. How loud do we talk? You know, how reticent are we? How passive are we? All of those things are a part of culture, but they're underneath the surface. It takes a little bit more to get at those. So what happens to students when their culture is rejected or not recognized by schools? And you know, the miscommunication, confrontations between the student, the teacher, and the home, right? If there's miscommunication, if there's a misunderstanding of the cultural dynamics and interactions in the home, if we have students who are new to the United States, we have students who are recent immigrants, we have English language learners, and that disconnect, you know, and then oftentimes, you know, we have one thing in mind as educators, but then students are processing that through their cultural lens. There's a disconnect there, and then the home. And so, you know, how does that communication break down? And what oftentimes happens is then for the student and even the family, alienation and disengagement. You know, if students, if they're feeling that they are, you know, not being recognized and not being heard, then they detach, and there's a sense of alienation that the school has abandoned them, that the school is not committed to their success. And we know that students who feel that educational spaces are harmful spaces and that they are not supportive spaces, there's diminished self-esteem, and eventually, if the appropriate interventions are not done in a timely manner, then there's school failure. Oftentimes, and we wonder why students disconnect, why students drop out. And sometimes those are familial patterns, those are cultural patterns, you know, that their parents, and those are things that are passed down generationally, that education and that school is not a place, you know, where students can learn, that there's more that we can teach through the family, and there's more that students can learn through the culture of the community. And so they will be in school as long as it is compulsory. And then once that time has passed, then we'll see students drop out. We'll see students step away from the educational environment, because it is harmful. And, you know, implications for schools. I mean, there's certainly, you know, as we look at our, you know, the arms race towards, you know, school rankings and numbers and data, you know, and we want to all have good school report cards, and we want to have good school outcomes. We certainly are impacted when students are leaving school, and they're leaving the district, and they're not completing their educational experience in the school building. So lots of implications even beyond what's here on this slide. So this notion of cultural clashes, excuse me, often silent yet powerful, very contentious yet confusing. So on the one side you have the culture of the school on the left side and this screen. So you have the beliefs and values and language and attitudes and expectations once you enter that school building. Your building, your teachers, your principal, your leadership, your classroom, all of those things are rife with culture, rife with expectations and attitudes and belief. There's a language that we speak, there's something that we value. And then on the other side, you have the home and the community culture, which again is, the beliefs and values and language and attitudes that are enforced and reinforced, again, often without our knowledge and true understanding on the home and community side. Well, when those two things hit up against each other, those clashes can be powerful and contentious, right? So you have that clash in the middle. You have that divide in the middle of the school culture on the one side, home and community culture on the other side, and students and families and teachers and students caught in the middle, right? So unfortunately, we won't be able to delve in a lot, but just kind of some takeaways or things that you can think about. What are some of the cultural clashes that are taking place between the students' home culture and your school culture? Think about that. I love this quote. Again, it's an African proverb. The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. And that is a profound statement, especially if we think about, earlier in the summer, late spring, when we had the protests following the death of George Floyd, and the racial unrest that kind of boiled to the surface, and, the rioting, the protesting that was taking place across the country. Right. And so, this whole idea of, oh my gosh, why are people, setting fire? Why are they looting their neighborhoods? All right. So the child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. Think about that. So this whole idea, as a slide that we just saw, we had the school culture on the one side, we had the home culture on the other. In the middle was this great divide and gulf that was this, full of contention and clashes. So what do we need? Who do we need? What do we need to have in place to bridge those two? And this idea of cultural brokering. If you've done anything around stock trading, real estate, oftentimes you will hear in that context, in a financial setting context, the idea of a broker. If you're trading stocks on the New York Stock Exchange, you're having a broker. And this cultural broker is someone who can bridge the school culture and the home culture. A cultural broker, even if he or she has limited skills or experience in education, could greatly facilitate the communication process. With a broker's assistance, schools can develop stronger relationship with students and families from diverse backgrounds. That cultural broker acts as that go-between, one who advocates on behalf of another group or individual. So sometimes your cultural brokers are your parents who are involved in the classroom, your PTOs, your community leaders, your ties to the community. Sometimes those folks can be cultural brokers. But really what I would like to, really center our discussion around today for us as teachers and educators in the school building, in the classroom, is how we ourselves can serve as cultural brokers. How can we put ourselves in positions to be able to facilitate communication process, helping schools, our schools develop stronger relationship with our students and families who are from diverse backgrounds. How we can, as educators and as school leaders, how can we advocate on behalf of our students with different, and divergent cultural experiences. And so we, introduce two key components of that cultural brokering: cultural competence and cultural humility. What is cultural competence? The ability to interact effectively with people who have cultural experiences, beliefs, practices, values, traditions, and ways of communicating that are different from our own. Um, often tackled by learning about the patterns of behavior, beliefs, language, values, and customs of groups. So it's a combination of three elements: awareness, knowledge, and skills. So, much of what you are doing and participating in now and have done since the start of your convention, but especially around this whole idea of building culturally responsive classrooms, is there's an awareness, first of all, that our students are coming from a variety of cultural experiences, and maybe there are some students that are being left out, or who are not fully embracing the school culture. So there's an awareness that, perhaps I need to increase my ability, to understand different behaviors and beliefs of different groups. And so then the knowledge piece, right, is then the professional development, the training, that you will get to increase your knowledge and your understanding, which then increases your cultural competence skills. Cultural competency knowledge involves understanding the cultural, political, and social factors that influence how people from another culture interact and communicate. Being aware of and navigating these power structures related to social class, gender, race, and caste, because it's not just race and ethnicity that has culture. Economic and social class, there's a culture within that. We know that gender, how our students present, our female students, our male students, and now our students who may be gender non-conforming, gender non-binary. What are the cultural aspects are we embracing at that point? And how are we navigating the power structures related to all of those things, and those groups of students or those groups of people who are privileged because of social class or gender or race? How do we navigate the power structures inherent with that and the privilege that comes with that? How do we navigate those on behalf of students who are minoritized and are marginalized and are not a part of those power structures? And how do we identify specific information about another culture that will help us improve our communication and our mutual understanding? Here's a definition that is specific to education. Cultural competency is the effective integration of knowledge about students' backgrounds into instructional planning and strategies, resulting in learning of curricular concepts at high levels. So it's not just about understanding and gaining knowledge about our students' cultural expressions and experiences, but cultural competency is the ability then to integrate that knowledge into how we plan our instruction and our strategy, so that we can ensure that all of our students are fully participating and engaging in the educational experience, and that they all have the capacity and are given the tools to be able to learn at high levels. This whole notion of no child left behind, I think, has certainly, we can really center that around this whole idea of cultural competency. So it's not enough just to know and to be skilled about different backgrounds and understanding traditions and language and culture of our diverse students, but it's our ability to integrate what we know into how we plan and the strategies that we employ to ensure that all of our students are learning at high levels. So here's this whole idea of cultural humility that then comes in. So cultural competence, on the one hand, is the skill building, it's the awareness, the gaining the knowledge, gaining the skills. But then the cultural humility is then how do we begin to integrate what we know from a competency standpoint? So cultural humility is that process of self-evaluation that focuses on how culture influences our own perceptions of other communities and the impact that that has on our ability to participate in successful cultural exchanges. But at the heart of cultural humility, and it really is a heart work, it is a very personal work. Those who practice cultural humility work vow and really commit to increasing their self-awareness of their own biases and perceptions. And there's a commitment to engage in lifelong self-reflection about how to put those biases aside and how to continually learn about our blind spots and how our biases impact how we perceive other communities, and the impact that our biases have on our beliefs about the ability of even some communities to learn while others we feel cannot. So that's, that's the cultural humility is the vehicle that then helps to deliver those cultural competency skills. Another way to look at it on the left side, well, I'll start with the right side. On the right side, at least for my screen, cultural competency says I'm the expert, right? So I've gained all of these skills. So the goal of competency or proficiency is to equip us with the right answers, as if the culture we were experiencing is a language that we've learned to interpret. Okay, so we're we have these skills. We're doing professional development. We're gaining some understanding about culture, the role of culture, and how students from diverse experiences and backgrounds, how they learn. But the cultural humility, that's our mindset. That goal is to equip us with the right questions. It represents a shift in focus from a confidence in what we know and what we think we've learned, really to deferring to those who are that we're interacting with, deferring to their knowledge. That idea of those funds of knowledge that people from various cultural backgrounds bring to our experience, to our educational spaces. And so when you put that all together, when you look at building cultural competency and then delivering that in a spirit of cultural humility, what you then create in your educational spaces is this idea of cultural responsiveness. So you are that cultural broker, right? So you are gaining those skills, you are practicing that continual self-evaluation of your biases, and then how you integrate and create this culturally responsive environment requires a willingness to dialogue about race and social class, gender, sexual orientation. Building a culturally responsive environment requires caring. That really has to be at the heart of what we do. Analyzing school climate. So that's how, in our earlier site, we looked at what about the structures and systems? What about the school itself? What do we need? Not, amending and revising students, but in what ways are our academic and our school environments harmful to students? And so, looking at our school climate, who feels comfortable and safe and why? Who feels uncomfortable and unsafe and why? So really interrogating everything about our school climate, which includes it, and continuously analyzing achievement and discipline data. Who are those students who are falling behind continuously? Where are those learning gaps and those achievement gaps? In what populations, as we disaggregate the data, are those happening most often? In our discipline data, who are the folks that we are putting out of the school building? Who are leading, the data? What groups of students are leading the data around suspensions and expulsions? And being able to really analyze if they are, if those high numbers continue to be minoritized students from different cultural, racial, and ethnic backgrounds. Why is that? And then being able to be effective in different cultural contexts. So, the neighborhood, if we have to go and visit parents, especially right now in COVID, and, support our students who are learning at home, how do we do that? Are we comfortable being able to then go into some of our impoverished communities and meet with our students in their homes and conversations and perceptions and what have you? And then assessing our own biases. Okay, and so that really should be at the top, assessing our biases continuously. So culture gives context and meaning. It is a filter through which people process their experience and events in their lives. It influences people's values, actions, and expectations of themselves. It impacts people's perceptions and expectations of others. So again, always coming back to what are the implications for our teaching? If culture is at the heart of all of us, every single one of us, and it's our filter, it's our lens through through which we process everything that has happened to us. It's all processed through a lens of cultural experiences, traditions, and beliefs. It's how we make sense of our world, but it also is what we use to make sense of other folks' worlds, right? And so a lot of times the problem happens when we use our perceptions to then put on others expectations of behaviors. And if someone doesn't act or talk or behave the way we think we would, then there's that disconnect, and then that's when we start to attach some very deficient language, because we really aren't understanding from a cultural standpoint the context and meaning, and this happens all of the time, all day, every day, in ways that we are not aware. It's so subtle, but the impact is so profound. I'm going to skip over this. This is just a little snippet of a question from a culturally responsive self-assessment, and there is a assessment that is out there that you can take. It's a cultural competence assessment. Is like a skills kind of tool to kind of see where you are on that continuum. And so this is one of the class. This is one of the questions. How often do you implement these practices in your classroom, right? And this, the practice of acknowledging and incorporating cultures reflected in the classroom. And so, do your visual aids reflect various cultures and show global awareness? Do the books that you select, are they reflective of multicultural and global perspectives? Do you carefully and strategically plan lessons that incorporate cultures represented in your class and in society? And do you do frequent and intentional knowledge checks to make sure that your culturally responsive teaching techniques are effective, and that you teach in ways that help students acknowledge cultural differences in their peers? And so, I would say, if you want to sit with this slide, especially, and really reflect on, how you're at your classroom right now, your education space right now. What are some of your, how would you score on this scale of how often do you implement these practices in your classroom? Okay. To reach others, we have to first know ourselves, and to connect and contact, excuse me, let me start over. To reach others, we have to first know ourselves, and to contact the deeper truth of who we are. We must engage in some activity or practice that questions what we assume to be true about ourselves. All right. So in order for us to do any of this, to be culturally responsive, to be culturally competent, to be cultural brokers, we really have to engage in activity and practice that questions some of the assumptions that we hold true about ourselves. And those assumptions that we hold true about ourselves, another way of putting that, are our biases. We all have them. Oftentimes they are hidden, or what we call implicit. They are unconscious. We are not aware of them. They are our blind spots, but they inform how we see the world. And often, and not often, in every case, our cultural experiences help to form those biases. And studies have shown that by age 3, we have already been imprinted with cultural language and context around people that are different from us. So, racialized stereotypes, um, prejudice, language, all of those things are imprinted on us by age 3. So, however old you are, since the age of 3, I'm 57. So, for the past 54 years, I have been operating in a space that has been informed by my culture, my beliefs, my values, and what I've been told about people who are different than me. Okay, so just sit with that for a minute and think about how long we've been moving around in this whole idea of our bias, uh, which has caused us to then we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. And so our biases, our implicit bias, refer to the attitudes and stereotypes that affect our understanding and our decisions in an unconscious manner. They can be favorable or they can be unfavorable, and they are activated involuntarily. That's the key, without our awareness or intentional control. So then what if we have biases operating all the time? That the way that our culture has informed the way that we see the world and other people, and at every moment we are operating from a space of an unconscious, subconscious bias, whether it's positive or negative. How do we then disrupt, interrupt, interrogate? How do we then have a change in behavior? How do we, what do we need to do then? This whole idea of debiasing. That's what, that's that continual process, as we saw in cultural humility, of evaluating, reflecting, understanding how our biases, how our beliefs, our prejudices, our stereotypes impact the way that we see others, and how that plays out in our everyday experience, especially as teachers, educators, school leaders. So if we're going to disrupt some of those harmful biases, then what needs to happen? This whole notion of debiasing, awareness that we first have biases. So if you've never taken the implicit association test, the Harvard project, I would encourage you to do that. That's all about uncovering your hidden biases, your unconscious biases. All right. Going through training, professional development. So being aware of the biases that you hold, the beliefs that you hold that are very strongly rooted in culture and tradition. And then being mindful in all of your interactions, how those biases are playing out. And then going through training and development to understand how to then adopt a new set of behaviors. Also, the more that we are exposed to people who are different from us, the more that we are exposed to different cultures, different experiences, to seek out those positive examples of those cultures, experiences. And then our approach, reflecting. That's all, cultural humility is all about self reflection continually at every interaction, especially those that are problematic. And we all know, ooh, I could have said that better. Well, I probably could have handled that differently. Not what about the other person, but what about me? What was that thing in me that caused me to react that way? And especially as we're under pressure and we feel stressed, right? So this higher level processing, self-reflection, what does that look like in our policies as we examine our school structures and buildings and policies and procedures? And, again, that question about, who feels comfortable and safe, who feels uncomfortable and unsafe. And so really understanding, because as humans, we're the ones that uphold the policies and procedures and structures and problematic pieces of our educational environment. So if we have biases that are problematic, and we're asked to uphold policies and processes and systems that were created by other people that have bias, we got to go back and look at how our policies, again, analyzing our school data, examining our school climate, then going through checklists and, just kind of making sure, that we're hitting all of those, the right points. And then procedurally, what's that organizational culture? So what about the school culture? Not just what about your personal biases, but what about what pieces of the school and the organizational culture need to be debiased? Okay. We maybe there's some cultural humility that we need in our school culture, in the way that we do things within our districts and our school buildings. Also, and I think this is a little bit of the same. Yes, it is. Okay. All right, so we're kind of getting to the end of, I know we've got a few minutes, and I don't know if any folks have questions or, anything like that you want to put in the chat. I'll stop sharing in just a moment. But kind of as we wind down, I know I've given you a lot to think about. And this whole idea of cultural responsiveness, it is a process of becoming. You don't just arrive at that moment and say, I'm here. It is just, because that process of cultural humility is a continual process of self-reflection, self-evaluation, and a commitment, to learn and to grow and to be better and to do better. And so it is a process of becoming. And as you gain the cultural competency skills, as you put those into practice, as you critically interrogate your biases and your background and your experiences and your beliefs, as you really serve in that role of that cultural broker, bridging those gaps between that school culture and that home culture, as you are deferring to your experts who are your students and your families, then the more skilled you become, and then the more responsive you can then be around creating and ensuring that your classrooms and your schools and your educational spaces are culturally responsive. But it's a life work, and it's a hard work that you will embark on and that you will engage in for the rest of your lives, because you don't just interact with people of difference in your school building. It's your neighborhood, your community, your church, you name it. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can hopefully get in on some discussions and see what we got. I think we got a few things in the chat we've got time for. Okay, got a new laptop. Help me out there. All right, so we have some few things in the chat. The beliefs that are underlying expectations can be so harmful. Absolutely. And the Harvard instrument, it's the Harvard Project, but you can also Google, because I just sent the link to a group that I am doing a training with on Friday. You can Google implicit association test. And then it will pull up the Harvard Project. The initials are IAT. And there are a couple of assessments. There's one, and they're free. There's one that you can register for. And I would encourage you to do that, to go on to the instrument and go through the registration part and take the longer test. That is a really involved test, okay? And do that longer version. But there is a shorter version. If you go onto that website, and it's the IAT website, there is a tab where you can take the test. You click on that, and there are 19 different tests that you can take to kind of assess where you are on your unconscious implicit bias. There's one for race, there's one for gender, there's one for age, there's one for weight. I think there's one for Asians. I mean, there's a host of, like I said, like 19, and those are kind of like 10, 15-minute quick assessments. And those are sorting instruments, and they take you through a series of pictures and then good words and bad words, and you have to do it really fast. And what it does is it sorts out your immediate response and your unconscious response to when you see that person. Do you attribute a bad attribute or good? Okay. And so it's really fascinating to take. And I guarantee you, it won't come out like you think. Every time I take it, it's something different. And I think I've kind of mastered that test. Absolutely not. I'm like, really? Gosh, after all these years, after doing this work for, 20 plus years, 29, 30 years, man, I still got a bias there. Yikes. Okay. And then that leaves me back to that then place of self-reflection, right? And then that place of, okay, then there is some knowledge that I need to gain. There's an awareness that I now have that that's a problematic space for me. Now let me go back, and then let me kind of do some more professional development. Let me gain some knowledge. Let me talk to some folks, let me do the things that are necessary. And I'll give this quick example, and then I'll kind of hop off here. Growing up, I was first generation. I was the first in my immediate and extended family to go to college. Grandparents migrated here during the Great Migration in the South, when people of color moved up here. So my grandparents had eighth grade educations. My parents, aunts and uncles, everybody went to high school, but nobody went to college. So education for my cousins, because I'm an only child, but my cousins, that was foremost. That our family took great pride in our education, and I was a great student. I was the one who was, teacher, you didn't collect our homework. I was that student. I took great pride in my academic work, and I associated culturally what that looked like to be a good student. Okay, what that meant. What are those attributes and qualities of a good student? When I got into, school counseling, students come, and I was in the space with the principal, an assistant principal, students coming to, kids being sent down all the time out of the classroom because they were being disruptive and they weren't completing their work. Well, I had a certain kind of bias about those students because I was a great student. and I knew that hard work and I had this great school ethic. And so that bias, even when I got into higher education as a professor, as a college professor, I used to be very hard on my students. What do you mean you couldn't get this work done? What do you mean you couldn't, that's an excuse. And then, I realized that my assumption about what it meant to be a good student, and the support and the cultural traditions around what academic success looked like. It was very humbling for me to have those conversations with students and to hear, um, I'm a single parent. I'm working 2 or 3 jobs. I'm trying to get to school. My car broke down. I don't have a computer at home. There's food insecurity. There's housing insecurity. In my first couple of years of being a college professor were so humbling. And that is really what started my journey around this whole notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I caused so much harm to those students, and they were freshmen, and I was failing students left and right. And I caused so much harm to those students. And I would read my teacher evaluations, and they were horrible about the classroom culture and climate that I had set up for my students. And it was then going through that whole idea of self-reflection. And then I went to my program chair like, ooh, okay, I want to be a better teacher. What do I need to do? And that was the person, and she is my mentor to this day, that started me on this journey to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and cultural competence, and everything that I do now. And so I am absolutely, this is my life's work, and I am committed to this because education and healthcare systems are the two major systems that cause the most harm to our diverse students and families and communities. So our ability to make our and to transform our educational spaces that then transform the lives of our students and us as educators and our communities and families. We know the power of education. We can't afford for our students to be checking out and being alienated and being harmed and wounded because we refuse to be better, that we refuse to interrogate and examine those parts of us that we are unaware of, that are but are powerful forces in our perceptions of others. And so, I would just love to leave you with just that whole understanding as we all set goals around New Year, and it's 2021 coming around. Thank God 2020 has just wreaked all kind of havoc. But as we head into 2021 and we think about our New Year's resolutions, I encourage you to really make cultural competence one of your big, resolutions. And even if you've gone through and you feel like, hey, I'm pretty culturally competent, it's a life's work. It doesn't end. As long as you are walking on this planet, you've got work to do. And so I hope that I can leave you with that. My time is coming to an end. I thank you so much for being on our session today. Please feel free to reach out to me if you want to know about any of the resources that I use, if there are things that you're interested in using, instruments that you want to take, assessments, resources, books, articles, anything like that you feel like you need to have a better understanding and to increase your cultural competency and proficiency. Please reach out to me. And I can be sure to get you that information. And thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your convention. And I am going to sign off now because my time has come to an end. And thank you so, so much. Oh, well, look at all of, thank you guys for putting all the kind words in the chat. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a great rest of your convention, and have, I know that you guys are under a tremendous amount of pressure as teachers and educators, and I'm with you. I stand in solidarity with you, and I thank you for the work that you are doing. I can't thank you enough. I am so grateful for putting it on the line every day for our students. And so I won't, let me put my email in the chat really fast before we head out. And that way you'll know how to get in touch with me to get all of these resources, and I see all kind of folks are, hey, how can I, send me this? So I'm a slow typer, sorry. Okay, so it's Lori Lynn. So if you're writing it down, it's Lori Lynn, LORILYNN 1027 at gmail.com. So please reach out to me. And yes, I will be willing, Sherry, I'll be willing to share my PowerPoint. So if you want, just email me, and then I will send you my PowerPoint along with any other resources that I can assist you with. Thank you very much. And I'm going to go ahead and end our session.